It was a humid morning in New York City, the kind of day when the urban heat seemed to amplify the restless energy of the streets. The sun reflected off towering glass buildings as pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, weaving between yellow taxis, honking impatiently at the endless congestion. Inside the ABC studios, however, the heat wasn't just from the weather. It came from the tension that had been steadily building among the production team, the hosts, and the audience. Everyone knew that today's episode of The View was going to be anything but ordinary. From the moment the producers announced the guest, a buzz had spread throughout the studio halls. Laura Loomer, one of the most controversial figures in right-wing politics, was set to appear live. It wasn't the first time The View had hosted conservative guests, but Loomer wasn't just any conservative. She was a firebrand, someone who thrived on confrontation. She had been banned from multiple social media platforms, accused of spreading misinformation, and yet had managed to maintain a loyal following. Now she was stepping into one of the most liberal talk shows in America, ready to defend herself against a panel of outspoken women who were no strangers to heated debates. Backstage, the final preparations were underway. Production assistants scurried around, adjusting microphones and testing camera angles. The control room was a hive of activity, with the director monitoring multiple screens, making sure every shot was perfectly framed. The teleprompter was loaded with the hosts' prepared notes, though everyone knew that once the conversation started, the script would be abandoned in favor of raw, unscripted fireworks. On set, the hosts were already in their seats, each mentally preparing for what they knew would be a volatile discussion. Whoopi Goldberg, the show's lead moderator, exuded her usual calm authority, but there was a noticeable edge to her demeanor. She adjusted her glasses, scanning her notes with a firm expression. Beside her, Joy Behar, never one to shy away from controversy, sipped her coffee with an air of impatience, drumming her fingers on the desk as if waiting for a storm to break. Sunny Hostin, sharp and analytical as always, adjusted her blazer, her eyes flicking over to the empty guest chair where Loomer would soon be sitting. Alyssa Farah Griffin, the show's resident conservative voice, maintained a neutral posture, though there was an unmistakable tension in her shoulders. Sarah Haynes, ever the diplomat, exchanged glances with her co-hosts, knowing full well that today's discussion would be anything but civil. The studio audience was packed. As usual, it was primarily composed of progressive-leaning women, a loyal demographic of the show. Some clutched their phones, ready to record moments they knew would go viral. The murmurs in the audience hinted at both excitement and apprehension. They had seen political debates unfold on The View before. But Laura Loomer was a different breed of guest. She wasn't a politician playing it safe, or a conservative pundit willing to find common ground. She was an unfiltered provocateur, someone who had built her career on refusing to back down. The stage was set. The cameras rolled. The familiar theme music played, and the audience erupted in applause as the hosts greeted their viewers. Then, with a measured yet unmistakable gravity in her voice, Whoopi Goldberg made the announcement. Today we have a guest who has sparked a lot of controversy. Some call her a journalist, others say she's a right-wing extremist. She has been banned from multiple platforms for her views, but she's here today to speak for herself. Please welcome Laura Loomer. The moment her name was spoken, the energy in the room shifted. The applause was mixed with scattered boos, an unusual reaction for a daytime talk show audience. Then from the side of the stage, Laura Loomer appeared. She walked in confidently, her posture straight, her expression unwavering. Dressed in a sharp black blazer and high heels that clicked against the polished floor, she carried herself with the defiance of someone who had been in hostile territory before and had no intention of retreating. As she took her seat, she made direct eye contact with each of the hosts, her gaze lingering on Whoopi Goldberg, then Joy Behar, as if silently acknowledging the battle that was about to unfold. She crossed her legs, adjusted the microphone clipped to her lapel, and offered a small, tight-lipped smile. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of expression, every shift in posture. The panel was ready, the audience was bracing itself, and Laura Loomer, knowing exactly what she was walking into, was prepared for war. Whoopi Goldberg, always the measured moderator, leaned slightly forward, her voice calm but firm. Laura, before we dive into everything, I just want to make something clear. Here at The View, we believe in open discussion, but we also believe in facts. You've been a very controversial figure, and many people believe that some of your statements cross the line into conspiracy theories and misinformation. What do you say to that? Laura Loomer didn't flinch. She had heard it all before. She tilted her head slightly, as if amused by the question. Well, Whoopi, first of all, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I know this isn't exactly friendly territory for conservatives like me, but that's exactly why I accepted the invitation. Because the reality is, we live in a time when simply telling the truth is considered dangerous. Joy Behar scoffed audibly, folding her arms. The truth, huh? That's interesting. Because let's be real, Laura. You've been banned from almost every major platform, not because you're some kind of truth-teller, but because you've spread hate speech and dangerous rhetoric. Do you really expect people to believe you're a victim here? Loomer turned her attention to Behar, her expression unwavering. Joy, let's talk about that. Because what you call hate speech is really just conservative speech that the left doesn't want people to hear. I was banned from Twitter for criticizing Islamic extremism. Meanwhile, terrorists, actual terrorists, still have accounts on these platforms. I was kicked off PayPal for my political beliefs, the same PayPal that allows Antifa fundraising pages to stay active. So tell me, why is it that when conservatives speak out, we get silenced, but when the left engages in real violence, it's ignored? A murmur rippled through the audience. Some people clapped, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sunny Hostin, who had been waiting for her moment to interject, finally did. Laura, you say you're being censored, but what about the responsibility that social media platforms and financial institutions have? When they deplatform someone, it's because they're protecting users from harmful rhetoric, not because of some political conspiracy. You're not a victim of censorship. You're facing the consequences of your own words. Loomer let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. Sunny, do you hear yourself? You're basically saying that it's okay for private corporations to decide what opinions are acceptable and which ones aren't. That's not responsibility. That's authoritarianism. And the fact that so many people on the left are cheering it on is terrifying. You all cried censorship when books were banned from schools, but when tech billionaires shut down speech they don't like, suddenly you're fine with it. The tension in the room grew thick. Joy Behar leaned forward, her voice rising. Oh, please, you're comparing book bans to being kicked off Twitter. That's not even close to the same thing. You didn't get banned for being conservative. You got banned because you were spreading hateful Islamophobic rhetoric and conspiracy theories about the election. Loomer, maintaining her composure, turned to Joy directly. And yet, when the entire mainstream media pushed the Russian collusion hoax for 4 years, that wasn't called a conspiracy theory, was it? When Hillary Clinton spent years saying the 2016 election was stolen from her, no one accused her of spreading dangerous misinformation. But when conservatives question election integrity, suddenly it's an attack on democracy? Whoopi held up her hands. Okay, let's pause here. I don't want to turn this into a shouting match. She glanced at the producers, signaling them to stay on track. Then she refocused on Loomer. Since you brought it up, let's talk about the 2020 election. Do you still believe it was stolen? Loomer didn't hesitate. Absolutely. The room erupted. Some members of the audience gasped, others groaned. Joy Behar threw her hands in the air while Sunny Hostin exhaled sharply. Whoopi's face remained stoic, but her lips pressed into a thin line, signaling her frustration. Sunny, shaking her head, spoke next. Laura, multiple courts, election officials, and even Trump's own Attorney General have said there was no widespread fraud. Do you really expect us to believe that you, someone who has no real legal or political background, know better than all of them? Loomer leaned in, her voice slow and deliberate. I expect you to believe the evidence. I expect you to look at the hundreds of sworn affidavits, the late-night ballot dumps, the videos of election workers pulling out boxes of ballots after poll watchers were sent home. I expect you to question why in 2016 we were told that election interference was a national crisis. But in 2020, suddenly questioning the results was considered treason. The back and forth had now escalated into a full-blown ideological clash. Behar shook her head aggressively. "This is insanity. You're living in an alternate reality." Loomer smirked. "No, Joy. I just refuse to live in the one you and the media have created." The audience was no longer just murmuring. They were fully reacting, some clapping, others visibly agitated. Alyssa Farah Griffin, who had largely stayed out of the fight, finally spoke up. "Laura, I worked in the Trump administration. I was in those rooms, and I can tell you, there was no stolen election. Trump lost. I know that's not what you want to hear, but it's the truth." For the first time, Loomer's expression faltered slightly, but only for a moment. She turned toward Alyssa with an almost amused look. "Alyssa, with all due respect, you turned on Trump the second it was convenient for your career. I don't think you're in any position to talk about loyalty to the truth." The room was near chaos now. Behar muttered, "Oh my God," under her breath. Whoopi sighed, rubbing her temples. The audience was murmuring so loudly that it was almost hard to hear the hosts at all. Whoopi looked directly into the camera. "We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to try to have a discussion that actually stays grounded in reality." As the screen faded to black, the noise in the studio didn't die down. Some audience members leaned over to whisper to each other. The producers rushed onto the set to check on the hosts. Joy Behar shook her head, muttering something under her breath. Laura Loomer sat back in her chair, arms crossed, satisfied. She knew she had won this round, at least in the eyes of her supporters. The moment the commercial break ended, the conversation would pick up again. But it was clear to everyone in that room, this wasn't just another political debate. This was a full-on cultural war, playing out live on daytime television. The tension in the studio was suffocating as the view returned from its commercial break. The camera panned across the panel of hosts, each of them visibly rattled from the first half of the segment. Whoopi Goldberg, normally the most composed of. The group exhaled slowly, bracing herself for the next round. Joy Behar tapped her pen against the table, her irritation barely contained. Sunny Hostin, her arms crossed tightly, looked like she was ready to launch into another interrogation. Meanwhile, Laura Loomer sat back in her chair, calm, composed, and completely unbothered. She had faced hostility before, but this was her element. Whoopi was the first to speak, her voice carrying an undertone of exhaustion. "All right, let's reset. We're back with Laura Loomer, and before the break, we were talking about election integrity," Loomer interrupted, leaning forward slightly. "No, we were talking about the fact that the media refuses to acknowledge even the possibility of fraud when it doesn't fit their narrative." Joy Behar's eyes narrowed. "Laura, for the last time, there was no fraud. Trump lost. He lost by 7 million votes. Every court, every state audit, even Trump's own people said there was no widespread fraud. You're living in a fantasy land." Loomer tilted her head, her expression almost amused. "Joy, you know what's funny? When Hillary Clinton lost in 2016, you spent 4 years saying she was robbed. You said Russia interfered. You said Trump was an illegitimate president. But when Trump questions his loss, suddenly questioning an election is dangerous to democracy. Do you not see the hypocrisy?" Joy's face turned red as she opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Sunny Hostin cut in. "Laura, there's a huge difference between raising concerns about foreign interference, which did happen in 2016, and spreading a baseless conspiracy that American votes were switched, ballots were faked, and the entire system was rigged." Loomer laughed under her breath. "You keep saying baseless, Sunny, but you refuse to actually look at the evidence. How do you explain poll watchers being thrown out of counting rooms? How do you explain ballots appearing in the middle of the night? How do you explain all these statistical anomalies that experts have pointed out?" Sunny shook her head, frustrated. "You're twisting things, Laura. The courts looked at those claims and they were thrown out because there was no proof." Loomer's eyes locked onto Sunny's. "No, Sunny, the courts threw them out because they refused to hear them. That's a big difference." The audience groaned and a few people clapped hesitantly. It was clear that while most of the crowd was against her, there was still a handful of people who agreed. Whoopi raised a hand, trying to maintain some level of control. Okay, let's shift gears here. Laura, you've been very vocal about immigration. You've called illegal immigration an invasion. Do you stand by that? Loomer nodded without hesitation. Absolutely. Sarah Haynes, who had mostly stayed quiet until now, finally spoke up. You say invasion, but these are families, children, people fleeing violence and poverty. Do you not have any empathy for them? Loomer turned her gaze towards Sarah, her expression softening slightly. Sarah, it's not about lacking empathy. It's about putting American citizens first. Every country has borders. Mexico has strict immigration laws. So does Canada. But when we as Americans try to enforce our laws, we're suddenly the bad guys? That doesn't make sense, Whoopi interjected. But Laura, the way you talk about immigrants makes it sound like they're all criminals, and that's just not true. Loomer nodded as if she had been expecting this argument. Of course not. I never said all immigrants are criminals, but illegal immigration does bring crime. It's a fact. Look at the statistics. Look at how many illegal immigrants are arrested for violent crimes every year. Look at the amount of fentanyl pouring across our border. That's not fear-mongering, that's reality. Joy Behar threw up her hands. Oh, give me a break. If you're so worried about crime, why don't you talk about all the American citizens? Committing crimes, why do you only focus on immigrants? Loomer shot back instantly. Because American citizens have a right to be here, Joy. Illegal immigrants don't. The audience erupted again, some booing, others clapping. The energy in the studio was now completely unstable, shifting unpredictably between outrage and support. Sunny leaned forward, her voice sharp. Laura, the way you talk, it sounds like you don't believe in giving these people any opportunity for a better life. Loomer's expression hardened. I believe in the rule of law, Sunny. If they want to come here, they should come the legal way, just like my ancestors did, just like millions of others have done. It's not about denying them a better life, it's about protecting our country, because if we don't have borders, we don't have a nation. Joy, now exasperated, rolled her eyes. Spare me the patriotism speech. You're just trying to make people afraid. You want them to believe that immigrants are the enemy. Loomer's voice dropped, her tone serious. No, Joy. I want them to understand that if we don't control our borders, we lose our country. And if you can't see that, then you're the one living in a fantasy. For a moment, there was silence. Then Whoopi, now visibly irritated, leaned forward. All right, we need to take another break. When we come back, we'll talk about social media bans and why Laura Loomer believes she's being silenced. As the cameras cut to commercial, the tension didn't dissipate. The audience whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others nodding in agreement. On set, the energy was just as charged. Joy Behar muttered something under her breath, rubbing her temples. Sunny Hostin turned to a producer, visibly annoyed. Whoopi Goldberg sighed deeply, trying to keep her composure. And Laura Loomer? She simply sat back, crossing her arms, a small smirk forming at the corner of her lips. She had expected resistance. She had expected anger. But what she hadn't expected was the thrill of knowing that, despite everything, she was dominating the conversation. As the commercial break ended and The View returned to live broadcast, the atmosphere in the studio was electric. The tension, that had been simmering since the start of the segment, had now reached a boiling point. The hosts looked visibly exhausted from the relentless back and forth, their patience worn thin. The audience, an unpredictable mix of supporters and detractors, had become restless, murmuring, gasping, and even clapping at unexpected moments. But in the center of it all, Laura Loomer remained unfazed. She sat with her back straight, her arms resting on the table, her expression one of unwavering defiance. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to make a statement. Whoopi Goldberg, now noticeably drained from the previous exchanges, adjusted her glasses and sighed before speaking. All right, Laura, we've covered a lot, but one of the biggest things you're known for is your claim that you're being censored. You've been banned from Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, PayPal, and even Uber. Do you really believe you've been silenced when you're sitting here on national television talking to millions of people? Loomer leaned forward slightly, a knowing smirk crossing her lips. Whoopi, the fact that I'm sitting here right now proves my point, because if the establishment and the media weren't afraid of what I had to say, they wouldn't have gone to such lengths to shut me down. Think about it. Why is it that conservatives are the ones getting deplatformed, demonetized, and blacklisted, while far-left extremists and even literal terrorists are allowed to stay on these platforms? You say I haven't been silenced, but you and I both know that if I didn't have a platform as big as this today, my voice would be completely erased from the public conversation. Joy Behar scoffed. Oh, give me a break. The reason you're banned from all those platforms is because you spread hate speech. You call it censorship, but in reality, you're facing the consequences of your actions. Loomer turned to Joy, unfazed. Joy, let me ask you something. If censorship isn't real, why did Twitter block the New York Post for reporting on Hunter Biden's laptop? Why did Facebook and YouTube ban content questioning the origins of COVID-19, until they later admitted that some of those so-called conspiracies turned out to be true? You don't call that censorship? You don't call that the media controlling the narrative? Sunny Hostin rolled her eyes, clearly exasperated. Laura, private companies have terms of service. They're not required to host content that spreads disinformation or incites violence. Your problem isn't censorship. It's that your rhetoric is dangerous. Loomer let out a small laugh and shook her head. No, Sunny. My problem is that I refuse to toe the liberal narrative. And in today's world, that's enough to get you erased. And the scary part is, it's not just happening to me, it's happening to everyday Americans, conservatives, Christians, people who dare to speak up against the woke agenda. Big tech is deciding what's acceptable speech, and anyone who doesn't comply is shut down. Whoopi raised her hand to stop the conversation from derailing further. Okay, let's stay on track here. Laura, you talk about being silenced, but you've built your brand on controversy. Some people would say you're not being silenced. You're profiting off playing the victim. Loomer turned her attention back to Whoopi, her eyes locked onto the host. That's rich, coming from people who spent 4 years calling themselves the resistance when Trump was in office. You all built your platform on opposing a sitting president and calling him illegitimate, but when conservatives fight back against the system, suddenly we're playing the victim? The double standard is ridiculous. The audience reacted immediately, some clapping, others groaning loudly. Joy Behar shook her head, visibly irritated. You act like you're some kind of freedom fighter, but the reality is, Laura, you've built your career on spreading paranoia and fear, and quite frankly, it's dangerous. Loomer didn't hesitate. Joy, the only thing that's dangerous is a media that refuses to tell the truth. People like you spend every day pushing propaganda, acting like you're the moral authority, but the reality is, Americans are waking up. They're seeing through the lies, and that's why people like me scare you so much. Whoopi, clearly reaching her limit, sighed and shook her head. All right, we're going to wrap this up. Laura, I think we've given you more than enough time to say your piece. Loomer, still composed, tilted her head slightly. Of course, it's always wrap it up when conservatives start winning the argument. Joy Behar slammed her pen onto the table. Oh, please! The audience erupted into a chaotic mix of applause, boos, and exasperated laughter. The energy in the room was so charged that even the production crew looked unsure of how to handle it. Whoopi turned to the camera, her professionalism barely holding. That's all the time we have today. We'll be right back. As the show cut to commercial, the chaos didn't stop. The audience murmured amongst themselves, some shaking their heads in frustration, others looking excitedly at their phones, already typing out tweets about what had just happened. The hosts stood up, some storming off the set, while producers rushed in to manage the aftermath. Joy Behar threw her earpiece onto the table, visibly annoyed. I don't know why we even give people like her a platform, she muttered to one of the crew members before walking away. Sunny Hostin was speaking. Quietly to Whoopi, gesturing with her hands, while Sarah Haynes and Alyssa Farah Griffin remained seated, both looking equally exhausted. Laura Loomer, meanwhile, simply stood up, dusted off her blazer, and walked calmly toward the exit. She had been through worse, and she knew this was exactly what she came here for. By the time she stepped into the hallway outside the studio, her phone was already buzzing non-stop. Notifications flooded in. On Twitter, hashtags like Laura Loomer on The View and The View Meltdown were already trending. Clips of her fiery exchanges were being uploaded in real time, quickly racking up views and engagement. Conservative commentators were praising her for holding her ground, while liberal figures were condemning The View for even allowing her to appear. The debate had exploded beyond the studio. It was now a national conversation. She smirked as she scrolled through the reactions. They thought they could silence her. They thought they could break her down, humiliate her, make her stumble. But instead, they had handed her exactly what she wanted: viral exposure, a platform, proof to her followers that she was fighting the establishment and refusing to be censored. As she walked toward the exit of the ABC building, she knew one thing for sure: they would never forget this episode of The View.